Linda, I thought we would start a little bit just talking about what the book is about for those of you who have not yet been able to read it. So can you just start out by telling us who was Herbert Zuckers?
Yes. Thank you all for being here. It's really nice to see some familiar faces. I will start by saying, to say what is the plot of this book is kind of a difficult thing to capture quickly. But Herbert Zuckers is kind of the main character of the narrative. He was a man who was known as the Latvian Lindbergh in interwar Latvia. He was a pioneering aviator during this moment in history when aviation was just emerging, and these pilots were flying kind of the first long haul cross-continental flights, and you could track their progression in the newspapers. The Soviet Union published kind of cartoons and then dispatches and photographs to kind of follow along as they went. And in Latvia, he was very well known for his dispatches. He fashioned himself as a journalist in addition to being an aviator. And so he came to stand for the kind of, national pride in some ways. And after the war, or during the war, I should say, he joined what was called the Arais Commando, which was led by a man named Victor Arais during the German occupation of Latvia. He was one of many Latvian men who joined this unit, including my paternal grandfather, for a mix of reasons, which we can discuss later. But this ended up being one of the most brutal killing units of the Holocaust in Latvia. And the reason why his pre-war fame is important to the story is because his face was so recognizable. So Jews who were interned in the Riga ghetto were able to easily recognize him as he was patrolling, as he was present and recorded at various massacre sites. And so, to be brief, he was a part of this commando. And then after the war, he and his family escaped to South America, to Uruguay. And in 1965, a team of Mossad agents, some of which had participated in the kidnapping of Adolf Eichmann, murdered Zuckers in a beachside bungalow in a neighborhood called Shangri-La. So the story unfolds from there, I would say.
And you yourself have a connection in a way to Zuckers through your own grandfather. So can you tell us a little bit, how did you come to be interested in Zuckers and this connection?
Yeah, in a very troubled manner, I would say. Basically, my family is from Riga, Latvia, and emigrated in 1988, right before the Soviet Union collapsed. And so I always kind of grew up hearing about it, having the languages all around me. And I never knew anything about this figure, my paternal grandfather. I grew up with my mother's Jewish family from Soviet Ukraine. And so I had a very different understanding of what her family's history was. But my paternal grandfather was this huge question mark, which for many, many years I kind of left alone, because what we knew is that he disappeared after the war. It's a pretty common story from that part of the world, not knowing necessarily what fate someone met, or at least I thought so at the time. And then it only happened, later, after KGB records from the Soviet Union started emerging in the 2000s, that we were able to find out more about this figure. We found out that my grandfather, whose name was Boris, was indeed a part of the Arais Commando, and so must have crossed paths with Zuckers at multiple points, and their names appear together in several documents, which was extremely disconcerting to find. And then we also found that he was registered as a KGB informer or agent of some kind after the war, before he disappeared under kind of mysterious circumstances. So, and to answer your question, Madeleine, the only reason I felt compelled to write this book was because I discovered this court case that was ongoing in Riga. It wasn't as if I was kind of you know, probing my family history for my own interest alone, but then I found that it was actually a question of ongoing litigation, that there was this pretrial investigation domestically in Latvia that sought to identify whether Cukurs could be proven guilty, if he could be proven to have been culpable in the killing of Jews, if he had been present, if he had pulled the trigger himself. And so I went to talk to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor said, I recognize your last name and your grandfather as a person of interest in the case. So, yeah.
So let's get into that case, which really forms the backbone of this book. And the book, as you will discover after you buy it, really works on these two separate tracks of both what's happening in Latvia today in terms of Holocaust memory, and specifically this case, but also reconstructing what might have happened to Cukurs. And so as you discuss, it's not only this case, which would rehabilitate someone who had been tied to many, many atrocities. There's also a book rehabilitating Cukurs, even a musical. Where is this desire for historical revisionism coming from?
Yeah, so there was this kind of proliferation of cultural artifacts, as one of the scholars that I talked to about this put it, that, there were all these things that were percolating in Latvian popular culture. And, so the musical that Madeleine referred to was called Cukurs, Herbert Cukurs, like Bond, James Bond. It wasn't a very elevated production, but the takeaway, the kind of presentation of it was that, despite the fact that he was in this killing group, he didn't have agency. He was kind of caught between two worlds. It was very much an exculpatory narrative. And it was at this moment, around 2015, when you get a lot of these artifacts coming up, these expressions of nationalist desire to reclaim this figure that they felt had been unfairly maligned. And by they, I mean this kind of nationalist sector of Latvian public figures, including some in the legal profession and in politics as well. And so, one way of thinking about it is as a response to what many people in Eastern Europe might say was a kind of memory imposed from on high that came around the time of EU accession for the Baltic states, what this moment when there was a desire from the West, certainly, to say, this is how we do Holocaust memory. You should do it too. Like here, build your monuments. You should accept this kind of culture of memory that we have developed. And in some ways, this is a kind of push against that. But I think in some ways, it's also, very much part and parcel of the rise of nationalism and denialism and the far right that we see all around the world. And this feeling that at this historical moment, it's becoming, somehow easier to pull apart what we might have previously considered to be established historical fact.
Yes, and I think the question of what is fact and how you can prove a fact in this environment in a country like Latvia is something that that your book really questions and goes into. I am going to ask you to read part of the book, and this is a part of the book for those who have not yet had the chance to read it that comes at the very beginning, and it's a way I think that Linda really presents these questions about how do we remember atrocities like the Holocaust, and what does it mean to remember them, and what is the role of justice in all of that?
Yeah. Okay, yes. This is a little bit from the prologue. Honestly, one of my favorite parts, which was written and rewritten many times. So thank you for picking this one, Madeleine. Okay. What follows is an exploration into how the memory of the Holocaust extends into the present and acts upon it, and what it means to guard and honor that memory in this new and uncertain century. It is a story about how every nation has its own tale of complicity and victimhood, occupation, and terror. It is at once a legal genealogy and a familial one, an effort to trace the roots of law's extending claim upon the writing of history. I chart the failures, victories, and silences of law alongside those of my relatives and their neighbors and friends, dead and alive. If memory is a milieu de rencontre, a meeting place, as the French scholar Marie-Claire Lavabre argues, then so is the bookshop and so is the courtroom. In memory, literature, and law, we encounter multitudes of stories, unfamiliar and often contested accounts of the past. These stories, these inheritances really, come with demands. To receive them is also to inherit a set of obligations and dilemmas. How much to preserve, how much to expose, how much to omit and hide away, how much to reclaim. I started out by studying all of these questions, only to find out that I was already living them. Along the way, remembering went from being an injunction to a knotted, nearly impossible question. The verb zachar, which means remember in Hebrew, appears in the Bible at least 169 times. The verb is complemented by its obverse, forgetting, the Jewish scholar Yosef Yerushalmi wrote. He writes, as Israel is enjoined to remember, so it is adjured not to forget. And in his canonical study of the entanglement of Jewish history and scripture, which I hope everyone reads, he traces the operation of memory across centuries of religious tradition. But when the time came in 1987 to write the postscript to the volume, he wondered if he had approached the question of memory all wrong. Not long before he started writing, a friend of his sent him a news clipping from Le Monde that polled French readers about whether Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, should be put on trial. The poll was framed this way. It said, of the two following words, forgetting or justice, which is the one that best characterizes your attitude toward the events of this period of the war and occupation? Yerushalmi was caught off guard by Le Monde's formulation of the question. And he wrote, can it be that the journalists have stumbled across something more important than they perhaps realized? He wondered. Is it possible that the antonym of forgetting is not remembering, but justice?
Well, I hope that gives everyone here a taste of not only, the content of the book, but what a phenomenal literary stylist Linda is. But to get into this question of memory, of justice, I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about what kind of evidence is being used in this instance and in this case, because often when we think about something like revisionism, it sounds like it's so broad, it's so vague, it sounds like there's this wave of revisionism coming from on high. But in the specific case that you are looking at of the memory of Tsukurs, people are building a concrete legal case. What was the kind of evidence that the prosecutor was putting together, and where was he getting it, and what value was that evidence?
Yeah, no, I mean, that was the question really that I sought to try to understand, because I was so bewildered when I started writing this book that this case could exist, that there could be criminal investigation into a man dead, and not only a dead man, but someone who was assassinated deliberately as a kind of mode of vengeance, and on his body they left a speech from the closing argument of Sir Hartley Shawcross at the Nuremberg Tribunal. His assassination was meant to be some form of justice, even if it did precisely, give him this cult of martyrdom and allow this wave of revisionism to, coalesce. But really, like in looking at the case, that's why I chose to make it this focus of this book, because you really see the specific ways in which denialism is made. And I'm not the first one to point this out, but I do think we're in this moment when it has become much easier. One of the strategies that has been replicated not only in this case, but also kind of throughout Eastern Europe, I'm sure many people have read about it in Poland, is that in cases that pertain to the Holocaust, whether it's putting Holocaust scholars on trial or litigating the guilt of some person living or dead, testimonies from survivors are entered into the record. That was partly why they were collected in the first place. And now in the intervening decades, we have labored so much to preserve and protect them. But when the person who gave that testimony is no longer living, in some cases, the prosecutors will argue that it should be thrown out. And so where they are successful, that really kind of precious documentation falls away. And that what we might have thought was kind of established fact is no longer all of a sudden. So it's about the kind of duration of a fact, duration of proof as well, which I find to be a totally fascinating question. But it was also about the history of the region. A lot of the evidence was collected by Soviet prosecutors. They were the first ones in many cases, particularly on the Eastern Front, to confront the crime scenes, to do forensic investigations that we still have, and to conduct interrogations of the perpetrators. And all of them were, of course, conducted under conditions which we cannot attest to, and were surely, compromising in some ways. And yet there, it is evidence. We do have to read them, and they do reveal certain things. But to the prosecutor in Latvia, any evidence that came from the Soviet period was suspect. And so that falls away. And so when you have so many things falling away, all of a sudden you have a very, very narrow set of proofs to pick from. And so that's how and that is supplemented by the cultural artifacts that you mentioned. And so when you have this, I don't know, like illusion, I guess, of a cultural consensus, that's when it can really kind of get away and kind of work itself into culture.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's so moving about this book and that makes it so powerful is that you do allow yourself to hold in your hands how difficult some of these things that we think of as solid cultural artifacts, solid institutions, the law, justice, memory can really be. There's a beautiful passage that I'm going to make you read now, where you yourself are in the KGB archive, an archive that holds facts or perhaps information about this case, but also about your own family, and you yourself begin to question, what you can really trust. I'll pull it up for you now.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I discovered while writing this is that when the KGB left Latvia, they occupied this famous building, which was called the Corner House, which now has been converted into a museum, although it's also, you can rent apartments in there if you like. But in the basement of that building, they left behind these KGB cards, registration cards with agent names. Only a selection of them, others were taken away to Moscow and others were burned. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of controversy and conspiracy over what those cards contained. And a few years ago, they were digitized and made searchable for anyone with a Latvian national ID to look at. So very interesting moment. Okay. And this is where, after I'm talking about those cards and what they meant, when people all of a sudden could go, very similar to what happened with the Stasi documents, people could all of a sudden go look at who the informers were. So I write, what does it take to prove that a crime was committed 50 years ago, or 70, or 100? What does proof even mean in a twice occupied nation, a nation that has had its people and property killed, burned, and stolen, displaced, and discredited? The state has changed its language, its legal system, its way of thinking and speaking and ruling. The national narrative has been radically altered one too many times. If evidence is the grammar of the trial, under these circumstances, one can hardly begin to form a sentence.
And I think one of the things that's most moving too about the way that that facts are constructed for these legal files is that, as you mentioned, there's a bit of a race against time. So many of the people who would be eyewitnesses to the events of the Holocaust are no longer with us, or are in very incapacitated states, or are dying. And one of the heroes of your book, to me at least, is someone named Edward Anders, or Edward Alperovich, who has been fighting to keep that memory alive. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about him.
Yeah, he was a fascinating person. He lives currently in California, which made him very accessible to me when I was at Berkeley. He grew up in Liepaja to a Jewish family. His family constructed a pretty elaborate lie to save him and his brother. Liepaja was the site of one of the earliest massacres of the Holocaust. We talk about what happened in Eastern Europe as opposed to the kind of architecture of gas chambers. There you had, it's called the Holocaust by bullets, of face-to-face killings. And he was growing up in Liepaja in 1941 as those were occurring. And so not only did he witness and escape from that himself, but he also went on to coordinate with Jewish survivors to collect testimony while the war was still ongoing and afterwards, for the explicit purpose of submitting it to the tribunals. Because in 1945, there were all these trials that were going to happen. There was a famous kind of British Riga ghetto case, which never came to pass, that he was trying to push forward. And he himself went to Nuremberg and gave a testimony, which was thrown out because he arrived too late, which is kind of heartbreaking. But because he played this role, in collecting the testimonies, the Jewish community in Riga really wanted him to testify in this trial. They really wanted him to submit his evidence, to say, like, if you're going to not admit any of these because the people are no longer living, let me at least tell you how he collected them, to kind of lend some more legitimacy to the facts. And I really respect him immensely, and I think he has this incredible scientific way of approaching this question. He was a cosmochemist ultimately by training, and his kind of second career is memorialization. And he said, what's the point of this? He didn't want to be involved. He knew the way that this case was going. He knew that, it would be kind of this ambiguous and ultimately revisionist effort, and didn't want to contribute to it in any way, even if his testimony would push against it. And I thought that was kind of, of course, his choice, and in some ways an honorable choice, to say, I have done my part. I have done this litigation, and now the time for this to be a matter of law as opposed to a matter of history and moral judgment has passed.
I wonder what reporting this has been like for you, because this is a story that obviously involves some of the most intimate parts of your family, but also I would imagine has been quite difficult for you as a person, as a Jewish person, as a Latvian person. I know that throughout this book, which you worked on for many, many years, you've developed relationships with many of the sources involved. And I wonder, now that the book is out, how do you see your own place in the story?
Yeah, and you were witness to some of the agonizing over the years. Yeah, I don't know. I think at the beginning, I started it kind of naively, wanting to understand how law was working in this particular case, and kind of being like, I'm a journalist, I can go into this, this imagination that many of us have, that we can separate ourselves. I had this like dream of, being kind of blank. And then of course, like within 1 hour, I discovered this was not going to be possible. That I was like impossibly implicated in this history. And so I think that's been one of the most difficult things, honestly, is kind of sorting out my own relation to it. And I thought it was important to intervene. I do hope that the book is some kind of intervention. And because it's a strange case, which no one knows how it originated, there's no formal plaintiff named, there's no deadline by which it has to be settled, that I can enter into it or enter this book into it rather, as my own kind of submission of evidence, and I think now I kind of feel as Edward Anders does, as he told me, that this is not a matter for law, and this is kind of a record of it, and try to make my peace with that story a bit, I think.
Before we, I'm going to ask you to read one more passage in a minute, but before we get to that, I just wanted to to bring the conversation up to the present a little bit, because I know that among the areas where memory and law and justice are very important to you as a journalist is not only in the questions of the Holocaust, but also in Ukraine, where you have reported for many years and are very familiar. And I would, after you've bought Linda's book, I would also encourage you to look at her New York Times Magazine story from last fall, which is about the architects who are trying to rebuild Ukraine and try to plan for a post-war future. Are there lessons that we, now witnessing atrocity, can learn from the way that the Holocaust has been remembered and poorly remembered, and maybe even is in the process of being revised? Are there things that scholars should be looking at to prepare for that kind of outcome?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So one of the things that I found, I first reported on memorialization in Ukraine a long time ago, but then I really kind of got immersed in that world the fall of 2021, before this latest round of war came. And that was when this kind of grand, ambitious memorial project was being worked on at Babin Yar, which, as many people will know, is the largest killing site of the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. And it was, the memorial itself was really contested. The choices they were making, the interventions that were being proposed, some of them very high tech. But there was also a thing about it to me, which was just a total triumph, which was that there was going to be some kind of grand memorial at all, because the only things that were there previously were kind of hodgepodge efforts. And the idea that there would be a public, not only museum, but also foundation kind of dedicated to memory writ large, that had the ability to expose all of the ugliness of it, and didn't, or at least claimed not to want to paper over the facts. I thought that was a really beautiful thing. And of course, one of the great tragedies now is that site, which famously, there's a poem written about it that says, there's no monument at Baba Yar. Now there is going to be no monument because it was bombed in the first week of the invasion at the end of February. And so literally the bomb hit a building that was supposed to be a museum to the Holocaust in Ukraine. It's just so, it's like ironic beyond words. But the other thing, and I was just there in September of this year to report, as you said, on the architects who are trying at once to rebuild in a way that makes a city livable after it has been totally destroyed, but also to mark it's this kind of age-old debate. How much do you mark? How much do you paper over? And it was interesting to see in one of the sites in particular that's become the European Bridge, which was blown up. All the bridges around Kiev were blown up to prevent Russian troops from getting in. And so this is one of the most iconic bridges. And it was interesting there to see how they were clearly channeling a lot of the memorial techniques that we would associate with Holocaust memorials and sites, and adapting it to this kind of new conflict in a way that I think is still unsettled. And the fact that they were thinking about this as all of these places are still being bombed and don't have power and don't have heat or electricity, like that says so much to me about the value of memorialization and these questions that we haven't yet figured out. So, yeah.
And what about evidence too? Because I know that this has been something I was just rereading the book this afternoon, thinking about how even evidence that you think of as so powerful, as so solid, I mean, what event has been more written about and more documented in a certain way than the Holocaust? How do scholars working today, how do you think that they're ensuring that the evidence of war crimes are going to be fully preserved and lasting for years to come?
Yeah. And so I think the beautiful thing is that because we have learned so much from the experience of Nuremberg and the sequential trials about testimony, about how to use testimony, how to collect testimony. And we have journalists who have worked in Rwanda and Syria and who have themselves been called to testify at the ICC to what they have seen kind of working on the case. And so one of the things I have been doing is working with the project called the Reckoning Project, which is being run by two incredible journalists, Janine Di Giovanni, who's a kind of veteran war reporter, and Peter Pomerantsev. And they have, with the incredible Ukrainian investigative journalist Natalia Gumenyuk, they have created a kind of consortium of journalists trained in how to collect testimonies so they can be admissible in a legal forum. And they have been very meticulously kind of going to eyewitnesses, being very frank about what they are doing, and noting how many times they have been interviewed, because these are all the reasons why their testimonies would be thrown out. And I'm also working with them on thinking about what a memorial would be like. You know, a virtual archive of some kind of testimonies that would be about the testimonies in particular, and perhaps not a physical incarnation. Yeah, and we will be publishing some of those testimonies from Ukraine, from the Reckoning Project, in a forthcoming issue of The Dial. So I hope you all read it.
Yes, The Dial being the magazine that we run together.
Yes.
Before we open it up to questions, I'm just going to ask you, Linda, to read one more passage. And I'm looking at everyone in the audience to make sure that you are beginning to formulate your questions. Yeah, so the floor will be yours very soon.
Okay, this is from the very end of the book, from a chapter called The Antonym of Forgetting, which is also the French title, which I adore. It's kind of my attempt to respond to the Yerushalmi question at the beginning. All over the globe, Second World War era cases are still winding their way through the courts. In Germany, the heirs to the Prussian monarchy have sued for their familial treasures. The historian has been litigated for uncovering illicit love affairs in concentration camps. Nonagenarians still find their way to the dock. They are let off with light sentences in the miraculous event that they survive long enough to hear them. In Amsterdam, a former FBI agent has supposedly determined who really betrayed Anne Frank. His team mobilized forensic analysis. They created a virtual model of her hiding place. They referred to it as a cold case. In January 2022, they revealed the identity of the man whom they suspect is responsible. The historians disagree with their findings. Will the ghost go to trial? A perpetrator's name adorns the Vilnius street where, a few years ago, a significant collection of Jewish texts was unearthed from a pre-war Geniza. In Poland, to study the Holocaust and even to hint an accusation and collaboration can lead to 3 years in prison, to a series of defamation suits. On judges' desks and in litigation offices, the testimonies of dead survivors are being picked apart. Depending on what side they are on and in what country they practice, lawyers are either lamenting that they can no longer cross-examine the eyewitnesses or are silently thankful for their deaths. A dead witness can be much more easily impugned than a living one. Remember what Edward Anders wrote, "Dead men tell no tales, but survivors do."
So thank you, Linda. I hope we can have a round of applause. I'm passing the mic to Alice.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any in-person questions? Yes, 3.
Excuse me. Did you think it useful at all to try to make application to the Israelis as to why they did what they did in the event that they had any interest in the truth coming out today?
Yeah, excellent question. So I did try. One of the most fascinating documents that I encountered was a memoir written by the lead agent on the Zucker's case, who actually went undercover and took on a fake identity and it's an interesting historical document because after the assassination, 2 decades later, I think it first came out in Hebrew in the 80s, he felt the need to explain what happened and why they went after him. And as with any work produced kind of in this genre by an agent of the state, it has to be, of course, taken with a grain of salt. And so there are several things that don't quite check out or don't correspond to, say, the police documents that were found at the murder scene. And Mossad, interestingly, has disclosed the documents from every single assassination mission that they have done over the past 50 years without excluding this one. And so I tried, and they had a historian assigned to, uncover or to document at least all of these different missions, but clearly this one, something went wrong, something is anomalous about this. And so there have been many, many debates about why they killed him, as opposed to doing a kidnapping like in Eichmann, which led to this spectacular trial. And one of the theories is that the Soviets wanted their version of the Eichmann trial to say to the world, we got this perpetrator. I spoke to, former Mossad agents, and then one man who helped co-write the biography of the lead agent. And he said, we don't just go, Mossad doesn't just go and kill anyone. Like, of course, we went with a mission. But it remains this kind of deliberate erasure in that history. So, I hope one day they declassify the documents, but they did not for me.
Thanks.
It's so great to be here with you tonight, Linda. I thought your book was brilliant. Just, I think a general question on the sort of memory theory aspect of it, which I like the most. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, to what extent there can be a surplus of memory, and to what extent memory can, in fact, be a prison. Because there are, and rightly so, there are Holocaust museums in every provincial to large city in America and even in Europe. And I'm not sure, David Reef has the famous line about how never again really only means never again will the Germans kill the Jews in 1930s, 1940s Europe. So, I mean, I don't know. I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for your attention to that question, which, I think coming out of writing this book is still the one that I find the most beguiling and interesting, and thinking about how, certainly I feel for myself, speaking of how I feel, like I do think that memory can be a prison. I feel imprisoned by it. And in some ways, this book was an attempt to write myself out of that, and also to think through how it can be, ridden of its volatility, right? Because what we want is some kind of consensus, some kind of stable understanding, which I think many of us perhaps thought we had arrived at about this period in history, right? With the kind of wave of construction of these museums. And right now I'm thinking a lot about oblivion and how it used to be this mechanism, which I think David Reef writes about a little bit, how it used to be this mechanism for this kind of prescription of forgetting, but that maintained the memory and ordering people to always remember what they had promised to forget. And so it's this commitment to acknowledging that memory is always going to be a part of our culture, but we do need to, in some cases, make decisions about when to forget and when to rid ourselves of this like constant awareness and almost vigilance about it. And I think we're at this interesting moment when we're confronting what that means, and so I've been trying to track how that will take place. There's this amazing scholar, Andrew Schenken, who has a book called The Everyday Life of Memorials. And in that he writes, of course, memorials are rightly coming down all over the world, but let's not make the mistake of taking that for history itself. You can take down a monument and then the history will still remain. And it hasn't been deactivated in the same way that a statue can. So yeah, thank you. I'm thinking about it a lot.
Let's go here.
Yes, so the first part of my question, you actually answered at the end of your talk, so I'll mention that, and then I'll ask the second part. So that you mentioned that in the beginning that the testimony that had been very carefully preserved of people who are now dead have been somehow managed currently in these trials to be discarded or argument made. And you mentioned that, well, they can't be cross-examined. You said that near the end of your talk. I don't know if that was sort of the connection, but also then you mentioned also near the end of your talk about how you're learning, or there's a group of journalists who are collecting testimony, which will stand up in court. So my question is, what does that mean in practice? And is also, when you say stand up in court, you mean stand up in court while they're alive, or
Yeah.
also after they're dead?
Totally. I mean, that's the, we don't know. I think that this is, comes out of a desire and need to do something, to collect as much as you can and to try to do it in a way that will work. But of course, there are no guarantees. Oh, yeah. Well, I was not trained in this way, to be clear. But the journalists, so basically it's Ukrainian journalists who are on the ground, who are going out. And so they're trained to kind of take the names, take all of the demographic data, be very precise about where the person was, what was witnessed, when, what traumas they have experienced since then. So they cannot be said to not, be of right mind or not have been re-traumatized by the very act of having to re-narrate the event, of course. And identifying, a big part of the interviews is taking like facial descriptions of the Russian soldiers, and in some cases linguistic descriptions, so that they can be kind of identified to different units. So it's that kind of like more forensic data that you see being collected. And as for whether it will actually work, who knows? Who knows what form these much desired trials will eventually take,
Yeah, let's go here.
Thanks for your talk. I'm curious to know a bit about how the digital media landscape has sort of affected the way in which people now in these countries are learning about the Holocaust, and sort of given the free-for-all that is the internet, if governments or any other body for that matter can construct a dominant narrative amongst people of any demographic, really.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that is possible, but what I have seen is that it ends up, as in the United States, certainly, I mean, I think that these kinds of people have so many more ways of communicating with each other and finding community. And some of that means finding community of people who are similarly suspicious of the past, who want to find others who are, believe in some conspiracy theory, and that, because it is written online in a public forum, that gets picked up in the search results, and all of a sudden that is out there for someone to discover who might be curious about this history. And so I definitely think it's an amplifier, but I don't think it's a cause. And I don't know, one approach to these things is just saying, okay, this is banned, right? This kind of speech cannot take place online. I don't think that has worked. I don't think it will work. But yeah, and certainly it has also made everyone can be kind of an amateur historian now. Like you can go, a lot of these archival documents are digitized. You can just kind of flip through war crimes tribunals online, which is incredible as a scholar. But for someone who's looking to take apart the facts of history, they'll always find a way. So.
Thanks very much for your talk. I just want to go back to your Ukraine experience. And about 10 months ago, that is like 2 months into the current war in Ukraine, a scholar named Madeleine Schwartz wrote an article for the website that I run, in which she speculated on what the impact of the current war will be on Holocaust scholarship and Jewish heritage scholarship. And she wrote, quote, with a new war, new atrocities against civilians, and a new collective trauma, World War II will fade in collective memory, lose its central importance in memorial culture, become overwritten with the experience of the new generations of Ukrainians suffering in the current war. The new war will reconfigure the way World War II will be remembered, but also written about. And I'm wondering if this is almost a year later now, I wonder if you in your reporting or your research have found evidence of this, that what's happening now is supplanting memory of World War II and Holocaust memory.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's certainly possible. I think it's a really, interesting hypothesis. I think right now what we can say is that whatever this conflict is absolutely recast and being told in the language of World War II, right? The way that it was justified as a, by the Kremlin as an attempt to denazify Ukraine. And, in the testimonies, you see Russian soldiers saying, no, you are fascists, you are Nazis, that's why you are here, we are here. And the Ukrainians saying, where are they? Look around, try to find them, and look at what you did here. Actually, is that not fascism? So I think in that way, it's only solidifying the memory of World War II, and necessitating kind of ongoing kind of attention to what those words mean on the internet, in public speech. But I also think, that hypothesis is right in some ways, in that, if we are lucky, perhaps it will kind of rid us from this prison of memory in a way, and make it something that we can engage with as, a historical event, and not as this kind of sacral, primal thing that makes it almost difficult to approach, and impossible to compare to other genocides, which I think is one of the, greatest wrongs of how we think about this period. So I don't know. I think that kind of the jury is still out on that, and it will certainly depend on the way the war goes, which doesn't look to be going well. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quickie, I think, about one of the remarks made early in your presentation, for which you are heartily thanked, by someone who's more of a columnist than a journalist. But I have attended a lot of trials in New York. And so when you mentioned the phrase person of interest, I wondered if it was a New York prosecutor who is using this term, and is it a common term from one culture to another, one judicial culture to another? And what have you done? How have you handled, unless you speak, you're fluent in Latvian, how have you handled the language issue?
Oh yeah, so I'm not fluent in Latvian. I had it growing up, but I have Russian, and so I learned Latvian over the course of writing the book, to try, not perfectly. I wanted to be able to read the novel in which my grandfather is portrayed, and I only, I got there, but it was really hard, and I kind of took lessons at the Latvian church in San Francisco, which was pretty brutal. But to answer your question, the person of interest, that was, and now I'm trying to, it was from an email that when I initially wrote to the prosecutor for the first time, when they recognized my last name, and said, you're a person with a similar last name is a person, I think a person of interest in this proceeding, meaning that the last name had come up. It was a figure, Boris Kinstler, my grandfather, who was named in several Soviet interrogation records, and who turned out was the protagonist of this revisionist historical novel that the prosecutor had read and thought I should read too, in which my grandfather is figured as, not only this traitor par excellence on all sides, but also as the person who ultimately configured the assassination. Yes. Oh, yes. Okay. He said, amazing. Madeleine found the exact passage. Okay. The prosecutor's explanation was accompanied by a postscript written in italics. The surname Kinstler, which belongs to the person requesting this information, is more or less significant in the Herbert Suckers case. This is due to the fact that one of the flamboyant members in the so-called RS Commando, where Herbert Suckers was a member, Boris Kinstler, had the same surname. Maybe it is not only a case of similar surnames. So he's saying maybe it's not only a coincidence. And then I write back, saying, of course. And he asked me for information, for documentation, which I said we didn't have, which is true. Yeah, so it was not only in these Soviet interrogations that I found him as this person who had been described. In some cases, the prisoners of war were asked to describe the physical features of every single man they could remember. And so he appears in those lists as well. And in this very strange novel, which was not very pleasant to engage with, I have to say. But yeah, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. There is one. Or not?
I can ask a last
Yeah, go ahead.
question, which is, how has this book been received by the people who you've written about and in Latvia?
Yeah, I mean, I think my kind of closest collaborators over the course of reporting were members of the Jewish community in Riga who were kind of unofficial defendants in the case because they felt responsibility to submit the evidence that they did have that Suckers was present at the killing fields, that he was a member of the RS Commando, that he did have a gun. And so I think, and I really tried to have it be a document of their labors, which have been kind of heroic and for going on for multiple years at this point. So I think for them, it has been a kind of boon to their case, I hope. But I think, and one of the things I was told early on was just be prepared to be attacked from all sides, because whenever you're entering into a situation such as this, where, this is the question of culpability in World War II is the question still in politics in Latvia. And not only that, but also about the relation between the Soviet occupations in which, a huge percentage of the local population was deported and many of them killed before they got on the trains for deportation or along the way or in Siberia. There's this kind of eternal competition between these tragedies. So I think for those who support the kind of nationalist stance, I don't think they like the book very much, and that's perfectly fine with me, I have to say.